empty bottle in the garbage.
Don't you know plastics go in the blue container?
Mayor Frank Jackson and the City of Cleveland are committed to keeping your neighborhood clean and green through the use of the city-issued trash and recycling carts. It's safe, convenient, and mandatory. For more information, contact the Cleveland Division of Waste Collection at 216-664-3717.
How did you get to be so smart?
I had a good teacher.
Good day, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Kowalski. I'm the A&R educator for Ohio State University Extension here in Cuyahoga County. I have Chris Brown with me, Master Gardener Volunteer for Cuyahoga County. And today we're going to be talking about soil testing. Our series this year is Garden Conversations, but the most important thing to start with when you're beginning to think about gardening is your soil, because healthy plants come from healthy soil. Now, how do you know if you have healthy soil? Well, there's different ways we can go about looking at these things. One of the ways and one of the most important things you need to do when starting a garden is first doing a soil test. So here in Cleveland, we have a number of folks who are involved in community gardens. We have over 200 community gardens within the city. We have a lot of people who are involved in home gardening in their backyard, and we have a lot of urban agricultural projects. However, we do have an industrial history in Cleveland, so when we're looking at soil tests, the first thing we look at in the urban setting is soil contaminants, particularly lead. Although there are other things we look at as far as arsenic, aluminum, cadmium, and those sorts of things. But we want to first look at is our lead contamination content. Now, soils do have a natural occurrence of lead in them, but if you had a situation where you possibly where a house was, where there was previously a gas station, or just a situation where a person parked their car often, that could be a place in your yard that you cannot garden due to lead contamination. The other things we look at in soil testing are going to be our pH level. pH is very important to plant growth for the simple fact that plants like a certain pH. Most plants prefer a pH between 6.2 and 6.8. However, there are some plants that prefer a lower pH and some that prefer a higher pH. So it's very important to know what you want to grow so that when you send your soil sample in, you will put that crop on your soil sample so that the results will be adequate for what you're trying to grow. In Cleveland, we're often growing in a place where a home was in the past. And what's happened is over the years, homes have been demolished, they have been removed, and then other soil has been brought in to cover those lots so that it looks as if their home was never there. And oftentimes the soil that's used to cover those lots after the home's been demolished is higher in pH than soils that are typically used for vegetable or fruit gardening. So in a situation that we have a higher pH than we'd like to, there are some simple steps that we can take to lower that pH, but first you need to find out what that pH is. Other things that a soil test can tell you are your nutrient levels, particularly phosphorus and potassium, which are important nutrients for plants, and other elements such as magnesium and calcium that are also secondary elements for plants. And once you have that information, you know what sort of amendments that you have to do to your soils. Typically in Cleveland, we tend to have heavier clay soils. Now there are some exceptions, but for the most part, we do have heavier clay soils. And that does have some implications when you are trying to grow a vegetable garden, if you're trying to grow flowers, or if you're trying to grow anything in your yard. The reason being is oftentimes clay soils have a really high water holding capacity. So therefore, water will not drain very well in those sorts of landscapes. And in situations where water won't drain, what will happen is the plant roots will be saturated, they will not be able to exchange oxygen, and they will then develop bacterial and all sorts of fungal diseases, and typically will die because they are just not in appropriately draining soils. So when we have that situation, there are certain things we can do. One of the most common and most recommended practices is adding organic matter or compost. By continually adding organic matter, what you're doing is you're raising the water holding capacity. When you add compost, you are then increasing the drainage and also increasing the nutrient holding capacity. So soils that have a high amount of organic matter are able to exchange nutrients easier than plants that do not. We also, in some parts of Cleveland, have very sandy soils, and those sandy soils are very well draining soils. Unfortunately, there are also soils that drain so fast that they need to be watered very often. And also, when you have soils that drain so quickly, they tend to also lose nutrients quickly as well. So if you're going to take a soil test during the spring, make sure that in the following years you also take it in the spring, so that your results are accurate and that they can follow trends of things that may be happening in your soil. For example, if you're trying to change the pH, you don't want to take the soil test right after you've added a sulfur amendment, because that'll skew the results. You want to make sure that you have given that sulfur time to react within the soil so you get accurate results. Oftentimes, soil testing labs will provide a certain sort of sample bag, but many of them will also accept the very easily obtained Ziploc bag. So you'll want to have some sort of bag available to you, whether that be the sample bag that the lab provides or a bag that you provide. The other thing that you need is something to collect the sample with. We have soil augers that many people can use. These can be purchased, they can also be made. However, most people don't have such a tool laying around their house, so we can use something such as a trowel. You'll want something that's at least 6 inches long and rather flat, so you can get into the soil deeply and easily and cut into the soil without a lot of effort. The other thing that you're going to need is something to collect and mix the soil sample in. A bucket, a plastic bucket is probably the best way to go, or a box or something of that nature. What you don't want is a metal bucket that could skew the results. So at this time we're going to actually demonstrate how you should prepare your soil sample. So the first thing that we're going to do is make sure that we have the appropriate equipment. We have our bucket, we have a soil auger if you happen to have one or have access to one, and we also have a trowel that you can use that would be just as appropriate. So the first thing that Chris is going to do is he's going to select where he takes his first sample, and that area is, you're going to make sure that has been cleared of grass and debris, because you don't want to have to pick out a ton of soil and rocks and so on. So as you notice, he went down about 6 inches. So for a garden, you're looking at taking a soil sample, core sample, that's going to be 6 to 8 inches. If you're going to do a soil sample to put in turf, you're going to remove the turf and then take a much shallower sample of about 3 to 4 inches. And you saw that he put it in the bucket. Now the next thing we're going to do is decide where we're going to go to next. Now, what you want to do for your space is make sure that you have at least 10 to 15 samples that you can mix up to create a composite sample. So what you want to do is do a zigzag pattern across the site. One thing you have to look out for, however, is places in your lawn or your garden that seem somewhat different. So for example, if you had a place where no weeds, nothing grew, there is something very different about that piece of land. So you're going to make sure that you separate that piece of land out to be a separate sample. Another thing that you need to look out for, particularly if you're using a lot that's been vacated, that there isn't any lower sort of indented spot in the landscape. Oftentimes, especially if that place is large, that is where the previous house foundation was, and that place might be chemically and soil different than other parts of the landscape. Now, as you can see, Chris is using the trowel. What he's going to try and do is take about a 1-inch slice of the soil and pull it out. As I had mentioned, most folks don't have a soil auger laying around, so a trowel is a good tool to use as well. It can be a little bit more difficult, particularly in our urban soils, but you can do it. Another thing you could use is a shovel or a spade, and that can work just as appropriately. As you can see, he's taking samples from different parts of the landscape because, once again, I always want to reiterate, you want to have a composite sample. You want to make sure that the sample is showing every part of the lawn that you are planning on using for your new garden. So now that we've collected our soil cores, what we're going to do is mix them up, because what we're looking at is really collecting a composite sample of the soil cores. So once we've mixed it, what we're going to do is we're going to pour it on a piece of paper. That can be newspaper or cardboard, a paper towel. And then once it's on the table, what we're then going to do is we're going to break up the clods. We're going to take out anything like stones that tend to get in soil samples, any large organic matter or roots. And once again, break up the clods as much as we possibly can. Now at this point, the soil is still too wet to be sent in as a soil sample. So what we're going to have to do is let this dry for a few days. We can let it dry simply air drying it. We can also put a little fan there, a tabletop fan that'll dry it out quickly, or we can leave it out in the sun for a little bit. And once this soil has dried, what I'm going to do is take about a cup and put it into my Ziploc bag. There you go. And I'm also going to label my bag with my name and whatever I'm calling my sample. Of course, whatever lab that you use will have very specific instructions. So whatever those instructions are, do follow them, because they will not be able to give you an accurate result unless you follow the instructions that they have provided for you. So once you have bagged the soil, you'll send it in, usually through the U.S. Postal Service, and about 2 to 2.5 weeks, you'll be able to get your results back. Sometimes the lab will send them to via Postal Service, sometimes they'll send them to via email, sometimes they'll send them both, sometimes there'll be an extra charge for both, depending on the lab that you use. But you will be able to get those results back, hopefully in time to do some soil amendment if you need to use some fertilizer or compost that would be appropriate for the plants that you are growing. So that's basically the process that we go through to take a soil test to send it in to a lab to be tested. So the last thing that we are going to do today is make sure that we're filling out our form properly. And why is that important? As you had mentioned, there are cases where if a person might want to grow a crop that's not suitable to their land, and whoever you're sending that into will note that you're trying to grow something that's not going to have a high chance of success based upon the information that you provided.
Because we're telling them on here
exactly,
what we really want to grow.
Exactly. So there's a crop code, there's what you want to have tested for, routine analysis, organic matter, soluble salts, nitrate, and you'll check which ones you want to have filled out. You're going to also write in what the representative size of the land is that you are sampling. So for example, 1,000 square feet, 2 acres, what have you. And you're also going to provide a sample ID, and that's the code that you use. So for example, you're taking soil tests in your yard,
Yep.
and you note that there's something different about one particular place. You're going to use that soil from that side as a separate test.
Okay.
And you're going to have to make sure that you remember that. So make sure you write that down someplace, because indeed we will forget those things, because I've done it myself. So you want to make sure that you have the form filled out properly and completely, because a lab will not test it if you have not filled it out completely.
So if I wanted to grow tomatoes in one part of my yard and onions or blueberries or something in another part, I would keep those tests separate.
Depends.
Oh.
Depends. Many crops will prefer similar conditions. So oftentimes there's just going to be a code for vegetables.
Okay.
But when it gets into your fruits, there might be several different codes, because fruits are very particular on the pH that they prefer.
And where will we get these codes?
Those will be included with whatever lab you are using. That'll be included in their instructions.
Okay. Now, Jacqueline, when we're going to add amendments to the soil, how long will it take those amendments to really take effect to make the soil increase the pH factor or change the pH factor?
Well, that's a great question, and also a very important question, because certain amendments such as lime are added in the fall. What's different between lime, which raises the pH, and say sulfur, which lowers the pH, is the reaction with lime is a chemical reaction, and the reaction with sulfur is a biological reaction. So lime you would add in the fall, sulfur you would add in the spring, but before your crops have been planted. Because the sulfur action that takes place to lower the soil is based on the temperature of the soil. It's also based on how much moisture is in the soil and how much you are able to apply. Now, it's much easier to adjust the pH before plants are planted. So if you have a concern that your pH is either way too high or way too low and you're going to have to do some amendment, try and plan on doing that well before you want to establish your garden.
Well before would be a week, a month?
I would say the year before is ideal.
Year before, okay.
Because particular sulfur can have what we call a phytotoxic effect on plants and burn plants. Okay. So if we add too much of it.
So when I get that soil test back, I may be able to plant what I wanted to originally, or I may not be able to, depending on the results.
You might not be. We've had a lot of cases where folks are really interested in growing blueberries.
Yes.
Now, blueberries, which many people are not aware of, require a very low pH. They require 4.8, 5.2, whereas many of our pHs are much higher than that. So that is not particularly the best crop to choose for a higher pH soil. You can lower the pH, but you will always be attempting to keep that pH low, which might be very difficult. So in some cases, it might be better to choose a different crop.
Gotcha.
So this segment of the show is called What's Hot on Hotline. The Master Gardeners of Cuyahoga County field a hotline every week, from Mondays and Thursdays from 10 to 1 p.m., where persons who have questions on gardening, different sorts of problems that they're having, different questions regarding wildlife, and they can call in and get free research-based advice from persons who've been trained to answer those questions. And Chris, I understand you had a number of questions this week on Hotline.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did, Jacqueline. And especially topical to what we talked about today,
Okay.
is our clay soil around here. A lot of people are looking at putting in raised beds, but their big question was, what should the soil composition be for a raised bed garden?
Okay. So in raised bed gardening, there's a lot of advantages, particularly as Chris had mentioned, not having to dig into the soil and actually putting something on top of the soil that you can garden from. Oftentimes, it's also a little easier on the back because they're raised up a little bit higher, so that you don't have to bend down as far to weed and plant and harvest and things of that nature. So when you're thinking about your raised bed, the first thing you want to look at is, what is your light? Vegetables need from 6 to 8 hours of full sun per day. Even though some can tolerate partial shade, you need at least that much sun to successfully have a raised bed vegetable garden. When you're thinking about the soil, there's a number of different ways or strategies that you can use. First of all, you can purchase topsoil. And purchasing topsoil is advantageous because somebody just brings it straight to you, and they can put it near your bed or dump it straight into your bed depending where it's located on your property. One of the things that you have to remember with bringing in topsoil, it might also bring in weed seeds, and you have to be ready to manage those things. There are also manufactured soils where companies on a larger scale are able to take sand, silt, and a little bit of clay, add them together, and then utilize that as a bed soil, is what we call them. There's one thing that you need to remember with the bed soils is that they do not have a lot of organic matter. So in cases, if we can demonstrate over here, you'll see that when we added the soil was all the way at the top of the bed, but over the last couple years, the soil has settled out, and what little organic matter is there is now gone. So what you'll have to do is yearly add some organic matter in. You can do that a number of different ways, by adding compost, by adding leaf mold at the end of the year and mixing it in the spring, or you can add a cover crop. For example, I have a cover crop here of red clover, and that has a lot of advantages for a small space home gardener as well. What other questions do we have?
Other questions, some brave soul was already growing tomatoes, and they noticed that there are white spots on the leaves, and they would wonder if is that a disease or is it what's causing the white spots on their leaves?
So based on this time of year, and because I haven't seen the plant itself, I'm always a little leery to give a diagnosis, but what could be happening or could have happened is that tomato, because we still are in the middle of May, could have been exposed to a low temperature. And oftentimes when certain plants are planted a little too early and not covered during cold nights, they'll have an effect on their leaves, and tomatoes, sometimes that can be little white spots. It could also be disease, but since it's so early in the season, I'm guessing that it is probably some sort of cold damage.
Okay. Now, one other thing in the raised bed gardens, people were thinking about between the plants, what can I put in there to keep the weeds down? And a new topic that's come up is microclover as a mulching component. Now, do you have an opinion or any ideas on that?
Well, there's some great advantages to clover. In fact, this is a clover as well. One, they are nitrogen fixing, meaning that they can take atmospheric nitrogen. Our atmosphere is mostly nitrogen. They have special adaptations on their roots called nodules where they fix nitrogen. So they're actually creating their own usable nitrogen. Now, why is that advantageous? Because most plants, well, I shouldn't say most plants, all plants need nitrogen to grow. And if you are utilizing a cover crop or some sort of barrier such as clover, it can provide the nitrogen that your plant needs. Now, it may not provide all of the nitrogen that your plants need, but it can provide some. One of the disadvantages that you have to consider with using something like microclover in a bed is that raised beds tend to dry out very easily. So if you also have another plant in the raised bed that's competing with your other plants, you're going to have to make sure that you are watering extra often to ensure that those plants maintain the moisture level that they need to grow appropriately.
Okay. So any other tips on weed control that people should consider either in a raised garden or in their regular garden that we want to pass on?
Oh yes, and we'll talk about that in our next segment.
Okay.
But to wrap up our show today, we're going to talk about some of the highlights of the things that we've discussed with regard to soil testing. First of all, why do you do a soil test? One, to see if you have anything that's of concern, such as lead contamination. Another is to determine your pH level of your soil. Another thing that's important to consider is if you need to add any sort of soil amendments and when you need to add them. And the last thing with soil testing is make sure that you get a good composite sample and you take many samples in the area that you are testing. Thank you for joining us today in Gardening Conversations, and happy gardening.